Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. I'm Kevin Grasso, your host for this episode, and today we'll be talking about Greek word order, specifically the basic word order in New Testament Greek. So while some scholars talk about Greek word order as if anything goes, we will see that Greek word order is not so haphazard. We go through Alison Kirks' dissertation on word order and information structure in New Testament Greek from 2012, particularly chapters 2 and 3. We couldn't get Dr. Kirk on the show to discuss her work, but I believe it is the best treatment of word order in New Testament Greek, so I thought it was worth me presenting her material myself. I follow the basic outline of her dissertation fairly closely, and I occasionally give my own take on her data and analyses. While I might have some minor points of disagreement or refinement, I generally agree with her main conclusions. What we will see is that there are clear examples of both VSO and SVO clauses in pragmatically neutral contexts in New Testament Greek. This is against many that assume that VSO is the only pragmatically neutral clause in the New Testament. Kirks Data, however, suggests that we need not decide between VSO and SVO as to which is more basic, since both occur in basic contexts, as long as we define basic as pragmatically neutral, which we will discuss later on. As the outline for our study, we will first be looking at basic order, what it is, and particularly defining it, laying out criteria for it. Then we'll be looking at previous work on New Testament word order. This is primarily taken from her dissertation in chapter 2, where she discusses the previous work that's been done. And then we will look at her data. So we will look at how she gives examples of all orders for subject, verb, and object being possible. But then she whittles down her data based on sentence types. So looking at what kinds of sentences we're actually looking at. And then looking at which clauses are actually neutral of those clauses that we are actually analyzing. So this will make a lot more sense once we get into the data. And then finally, she talks about the non-neutral clauses and why those clauses are not neutral. So we know that every order is possible. The question is every order then neutral, right? The answer will be no, but where we'll end up is that two clauses are neutral, SVO and VSO, and the other clauses are not neutral, and there's some reason for that order. So that's the basic idea. And then we will talk about the VSO-SVO alternation, which is attested in other languages as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that and why that's the case, and then we will draw some conclusions. So first, we need to talk about the notion of basic word order. What is it? What criteria do we have to establish basic word order? So in her dissertation, she goes through different criteria. I would refer you, if you haven't listened to our episode on Hebrew word order, on the debate between SVO and VSO, we dive into that debate, which is another hot topic. And we specifically go through different authors' criteria for establishing basic order. So she does something very similar, and she goes through, frequency, distributional markedness, which we actually discussed in that episode as well. So she basically says that frequency is nice, but it's not something that is going to make an order basic. And distributional markedness is basically the idea that, if you can find one type of clause in a particular environment, and then another type of clause, so like let's say VSO in English, right? If we can find that only in questions, and then we find SVO in regular indicative clauses and other types of clauses, then the VSO is marked because it occurs only in a specific environment, right? That's distributional markedness. So she basically says that these two ideas are not really what she's getting after with basic order. So she defines basic order as a clause in which no element has a special topic or focus interpretation. So we'll have to get into what exactly topic and focus are, right? And again, I would refer you to our podcast episode on an introduction to pragmatics concepts. And we will go over that briefly here in this episode. There we talk more extensively about topic and focus, what they actually are. So that's how she defines it, right? A clause in which no element has a special topic or focus interpretation. So basically, that's what we're calling pragmatically neutral, okay? And then this has a certain derivation, right? She says a clause in which no element is derived through topic or focus movement. So the idea is that if you have an element that is topicalized or focalized in a specific clause, there's an element in there that moves to a topic or focus position. And that topic or focus position is usually to the left of the verb. It's in what's called the left periphery. But the idea is that when you have that kind of derivation, it's not pragmatically neutral, okay? So the implications of this is that a surface string is not necessarily a homogeneous class. This is a very important point that we will come back to. The idea is that, let's say we look at two sentences, they both have SVO order, right? So let's say Tim hit the ball and Tim hit the ball. So in Tim hit the ball, there's no focus on any constituent, right? Once I say Tim hit the ball, I'm putting focus on Tim. I'm putting stress on him. And basically what focus is in this case is bringing up a set of alternatives and it's negating them. So we're saying it was Tim and not other people that hit the ball. So the point here is that in other languages, right, you might have movement with that co-occurs with the intonation, for example. In English, we can't see this, right? So we in both cases, we have a string of, subject, verb, object. That's our clause. But in one case, the subject is in a focus position. In another case, it's not, right? So the point is that a surface string might look exactly the same, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the pragmatics behind it, right, is exactly the same. So there could be an element in a subtopic or focus position that we just don't see reflected in the order because of just other parameters in the language. So the fact that in English, the normal order is subject, verb, object means that when we put focus on the subject, we actually don't really move constituents for focus in English. But in other languages you might. So, but the point would be that when we put focus on the subject, it's not changing because we had that basic order anyway. So then another implication is that any order without pragmatic marking is basic by definition, right? So if we were to have, SOV and VOS as two basic orders, right? Or if we found clauses where it was clear that those orders were basic, then we would have to say, right, that this language just has two basic orders, right? Because by definition, any pragmatically neutral clause is a basic order, right? And so that's what we're going to conclude, is that you can find clear examples of both VSO and SVO in pragmatically neutral contexts, and we're going to talk about what those contexts are. So therefore, the conclusion is that both of those are basic orders. So now let's dive into some of the previous work. So she goes through this, Kirk, in her dissertation. So if you look at sort of standard grammars, she doesn't really talk about this much. I think she mentions it, but many traditional and standard grammars of the New Testament will just say, "Oh, VS is basic." It is interesting because it doesn't seem to be as big of a deal within New Testament studies. This debate over subject verb versus verb subject, as in Hebrew, for example. But many times it's just assumed that VS is basic. Again, very similar to Hebrew, where VS is also often assumed. But if you look at the some of the linguistic studies that have been done on it since the early 80s, there is quite a bit of variation or disagreement in the field. So we can start with Freiberg in 1982. Basically, the conclusion was from the study that SVO is the most common, but VSO is basic. And therefore, SVO was ruled out as being basic because it is marked. Okay? So Freiberg wasn't as concerned with frequency, but as something like, pragmatically neutral. And so he saw, okay, there are SVO clauses that are pragmatically marked. Therefore, VSO is the basic order. And then we have Reif and Terry. So Terry, in 1993, took Reif's data from 1933 and kind of did his own study. And the conclusion was SVO is basic. And one of the points that was brought up in this study was that sometimes VSO also has a topicalized subject, right? So the idea was that you have clear examples of SVO that are basic, and just because the subject is sometimes a topic doesn't mean that that's not basic, because you also have instances where the subject is a topic where you have a VSO order. Okay, so we'll come back to these two ideas. Davison, 1989, said SVO is more common than VSO, but some SVO clauses are marked, but both can be neutral. So this is basically the conclusion that we're going to come to. We're just going to talk more about it and derive it in a way that makes sense. And then Taylor, 1994, said that SVO is basic based on frequency. So the conclusions that we can come to are actually pretty solid. So everyone agrees that SVO is more common. If you just look at the data, and we will get into this data, particularly looking at Nicolas Levitas' work, and he looks at the whole New Testament, and this is again a conclusion that we can safely come to, that SVO is more common from a frequency standpoint, but that doesn't mean it's basic, right? Most people do agree that VSO can be basic. There are some disagreements in this. Terry, for example, says that VSO is not the basic order, particularly because there are no VSO clauses in 1 Corinthians. And so the argument is that, if there are no basic clauses, or if there are no clauses with that word order, it can't be basic. Another conclusion is that SVO can be marked. So this seems to be pretty solid across the board. Most people say that SVO at least can be marked, right? Whether or not it always is the debate, right? And this actually will be a big part of what we do. Can SVO be basic, right? That's part of the big question. So we're gonna assume that VSO is basic, but can SVO also be basic? We will look at contexts, right? These pragmatically neutral contexts to see, okay, what surfaces in these contexts? Is it VSO? Is it SVO? Is it both? Right? And we will actually see both. So that's previous work on the debate. And here are just some statistics. So I am showing this as a presentation. If you are just listening to this, I'm going to just run through this data from Levitas. I would encourage you to go check out the YouTube video as well if you're really interested in the data. So this is from Levitas 2015, and he's a very good linguist. We actually talked about him getting on the podcast. He was going to, but then couldn't. Hopefully we'll have him on someday. But his data, so he looked for all clauses with nominative and accusative. So nominative subject, accusative object, and a verb, and nothing intervening. And all clauses in the New Testament. He actually did it for the Septuagint as well. And the Septuagint data is also very interesting. But he sees that SVO, so nominative, verb, accusative, in the New Testament is 47.5%. So that's a very high number. Verb, nominative, accusative, so verb, subject, object is 15.1%. So, triple the amount of clauses in SVO versus VSO. And again, what's important about this, right, is Levitas's criteria. Okay, so he's not looking at every single clause. He's looking at every clause with a nominative subject, accusative object, right, and a verb, and nothing intervening. Okay, so that's an important point that we will come back to, is like when we're counting clauses, what sort of criteria are we using? What are we counting? And this was an issue in Hebrew as well. When you just look at, like, when you throw out numbers of percentages, right, it begs the question, okay, what are we including in our data and what are we not? But that is Levitas's work, and Levitas is a very good linguist. The reason for this sort of broad scope study was just to see, okay, in general, what orders are we seeing with in the New Testament and in the Septuagint. So the Septuagint data, he had 22% SVO and 21% VSO, and this could be a reflection. I mean, there could be a number of things going on here. This could be a reflection of more victol clauses in the Septuagint being translated as VSO. There's lots of potential reasons for that, but again, you can look at his work for some discussion on that. So that is his data. So again, but this data agrees with Kirks data, like we will see, and with really every other study that I've seen on when clauses are counted. Usually SVO is dominant. So let's get into Kirks data. So she begins by noting, like we've said, that every order is possible. So this is an important point because this is something that is not common, right? I mean, it's not necessarily the case in every language. Certainly not in English, that you could have every order between subject, verb, and object attested. So she gives examples. SVO, Matthew 1:2, Abraham genesen ton Isaac. So here we have Abraham, as the subject, genesen as the verb, and ton Isaac as the object. Okay, so crucially, right, in order to find these 6 examples, these 6 variations, she has to include only clauses with a subject, an overt subject, and an overt object. So that, starting out, we are whittling down the number of clauses we're looking at. So she's not just looking at, verb subject versus subject verb, right? She's looking at verb subject object versus subject verb object. And this is, again, an important point and something that we discussed a good bit in the episode on basic order in Hebrew is, okay, what does the presence of an object have to do with the order? Well, it actually does affect the order of the sentence sometimes. So that's why we when we are looking at the basic order, we have to figure out what kinds of clauses we're going to count. And this is what Kirk does, right? She's just looking at clauses with an object. So the VSO order, I'm not going to read all these, but I'll read the VSO one. Megalune he psyche mu ton kyrion. This is from Luke 1:46. This is Mary's prayer. Within Mary's prayer, so my soul magnifies the Lord, and so this is an example, right? Megalune is the verb, he psyche mu is the subject, and ton kyrion is the object, right? And so she has more examples of this for SOV, OVS, VOS, and OSV. Right? And actually, we're going to talk about some of these examples later when we talk about non-neutral orders. So the task, once we see this data, right, what do we do with it, right? Do we conclude that any order is possible? The task at this point is to see, okay, I'm going to look at all the SOV clauses, for example, and see if there's a pattern. See if there's something in the syntax or something in the context that is triggering this order, right? That's the idea. So now what she's going to do is say, okay, for SOV, why do we have this order, right? Can I say something about some sort of pattern about this data? And the answer is going to be yes, right? For every clause type except for SVO and VSO. That's the idea. Okay. So before we get there, we do need to talk a little bit about sentence type. So I did mention this, right, for Kirk. I mentioned it several times for both Levitas and Kirk, right? What clauses are we actually counting? So I said that Levitas counted only sentences with a subject in nominative case, a verb, and an object in accusative case. So he had a particular definition then of object, right? Of necessarily being accusative. Kirk actually doesn't hold to that same definition. She says that an object should be defined as, something that is basically semantic. So either a patient or a theme. The idea is that an object, right? The problem is that it can be either a syntactic notion or a semantic notion. Syntactically, it's very easy to see, right? If we just say, okay, if it has accusative case, it's an object, right? But other people have defined object semantically, and they've said, okay, maybe object is not so much a syntactic notion, but a semantic notion, because we know that accusative case surfaces differently in different languages. So the question then is, is it an object in one language and not an object in another? That's an open question, right? But what people have done then is to say, okay, well, if we can give a semantic definition to object, then we can try to unify, the syntactic data across languages. So the idea is that an object has a certain, what's called a thematic role. So as a patient or a theme, it's something that is being affected by the action of the verb. That's a very loose definition, but that's the basic idea. Again, there's tons of literature on this that we don't have to get into now, but this affects what's being counted, right? Another difference is that Levitas, from what I could see, seems to include pronouns. I'm sure he knows that pronouns often behave differently syntactically than full noun phrases or determiner phrases. That being said, he seems to include them, but Kirk does not. Kirk says, if you're a pronoun, I don't count you. And again, there are reasons for that. Pronouns do behave differently syntactically across languages, and there's evidence that happens in Greek as well. So if we just look, for example, at Levitas's Luke data versus Kirk's Luke data, both find that SVO is dominant. So Levitas finds 41% SVO and 21% VSO. But Kirk, in her data, finds 38% SVO, so a little bit less on SVO, and 35% on VSO. So that's a pretty big difference, right? And this all depends on what we're counting. So for Kirk, like we've said, is she's not including any pronouns. She's also only including main clause assertions. So she's not including subordinate clauses, and she's not including questions or anything like that. So it's a main clause, not subordinate clause. Assertion, meaning not question or any other kind of sentential mood. She's only including finite verbs, so no infinitive clauses, and overt subjects and pronouns, no pronouns. Overt subjects and objects, no pronouns. And the subject and object are not participial forms. So she basically says that sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between a participle that is acting as an argument of a verb and that might be modifying a verb. So she just says, okay, I'm not including those. So all of that to say, I agree in general more so with Kirk's criteria for what should be counted. I think that, I would probably might include only accusative objects as my definition of object, but But regardless, by looking at only main clause assertions, finite verbs, no pronouns, this is whittling down our number of clauses, but it's doing so to get rid of things that we know are affecting the order of the clause, right? The constituents in the clause. So this is a really important thing to do up front, and I think Kirk does it very well. So I think her criteria are very good. So let's just look at her data at this point. So I'm going to just, again, go through this. So she is looking at only Matthew, Luke, 1 Corinthians, and Revelation. So the idea behind just, handling a smaller corpus is it allows her to do more with it. So, she, in her dissertation, she goes through basic order in questions, how it's related to topic and focus, relative clauses, a lot of different things, right? And just wouldn't be feasible to do that for the entire New Testament. But again, her data is pretty reflective of the data from Levitas, and it's pretty, it's just pretty similar. So, and she does include several different authors, right? Matthew, Luke, 1 Corinthians, and Revelation, to say, okay, I'm not just looking at one particular strand of the New Testament Greek, right? But what is the basic order in New Testament Greek in general? So for SVO, she has 85 total. So she has this footnote right next to it. She has 52 clauses in Matthew for SVO, and she has a footnote saying, okay, well, 38 of them are from the genealogy in the beginning of Matthew. So I actually took that data out and I counted it as one clause. And if we do that, we're left with 48. For VSO, we have 32. For SOV, we have 21, which is still a pretty significant number. For OVS, we have 9. For VOS, we have 4. And for OSV, we have 3. So again, the data taking out, the most of the clauses in Matthew with the genealogy, we have 41% SVO, 27% VSO, and then the other big one is SOV with 18%, and then the OVS, VOS, and OSV make up the rest of the about 13%. So this is, again, pretty similar to the data from Levitas. SVO is clearly statistically dominant, but it isn't so much that it should lead us to just conclude that SVO is the basic order. Right now, we'd have to go through and look at all the clauses, see, okay, do these SVO clauses occur in basic contexts or in pragmatically neutral contexts? Do the VSO clauses occur in pragmatically neutral contexts? Even an SVO, SOV that makes up 18%, we'd have to ask, okay, why? And like, why do we have so many of these SOV clauses? What about them, or what about the context is triggering this sort of movement? So at this point, we're going to look first at the neutral clauses. So the idea here, right, is to now look at specific contexts where the pragmatics are not in play, right? So let's go back to her definition of a neutral clause. She says a clause in which no element has a special topic or focus interpretation. So in order to define this kind of context, we have to obviously define what topic and focus are. So she mentions Krivka 2007 in her basic definitions of the terms. Again, I would encourage you to go back and listen to the basic pragmatics concepts episode, where I also talk about Krivka's definitions. But we can define topic as as something that identifies the set of entities which are being talked about and about which new information is added to the common ground. So the common ground is basically the shared, again, this is not precise, but basically the shared set of propositions that the speaker and hearer consider to be true, right? Again, that's not precise, but it'll work for us. Focus is defined as it may give the answer to a question and is often associated with a set of alternatives. So I mentioned this earlier. Tim hit the ball, right? Is negating the alternatives to Tim. So Tim hit the ball, not Susie, right? Not Bill. So that's what we often think of when we do have an element that is in a focus position. We often think of those other alternatives and we negate them. And this is, again, it is associated with these question and answer pairs. So who hit the ball? Tim, right? So the who hit the ball is this question about, okay, who did this particular act, right? So we go through all the alternatives and we say Tim, right? We're negating all of the other alternatives, right? This is why these question answer kind of pairs are often associated with focus. So now our task is to find neutral contexts where topic and focus are not viable, right? So the idea is we have all this data, right? We have a lot of SVO clauses. We have a good bit of VSO clauses, some SOV and a handful of the other ones. So we have all this data. Now we need to figure out, okay, if we go back to those clauses, do we find any of each of the orders in contexts that don't seem to be triggering, a topic or focus interpretation of one of the constituents, right? That's the basic idea. So Kirk comes up with 3 kinds of neutral contexts. So like pragmatically neutral contexts. Okay, so they are situational sentences, answers to a broad focus question, and introduction to parables. So we're going to go through these one at a time. First is situational sentences. So this is how she defines a situational sentence. They are it is a backgrounded clause that occurs in a narrative describing participants' psychological state. This is a neutral environment in the sense that the subject is not under presentational focus, it is not previously introduced nor resumed later in the discourse, and finally is not compared or contrasted with the subject in a parallel clause. So all of those kinds of things, right, might trigger movement. She doesn't say it would, but it might. And so this kind of context, she says, is good for figuring out what clause might be neutral, right? What clause in this kind of context surfaces? And she finds 2 orders, VSO and SVO. So VSO is an example in Luke 7:6. Elaben de phobos pantas. So elaben is the verb, right? Phobos is the subject, and pantas is the object, right? So we have VSO order, right? And so this is what she defines as a situational sentence. And then we have an example from Luke 5:26. Kai ekstasis elaben hapantas, right? So here we have ecstasis, amazement. Elaben took hold of. Hapantas, everyone, right? So these are actually very close. I mean, this is a great sort of minimal pair. In the VSO, we have elaben, same verb, right? Took hold of. Phobos, right? Again, a very similar word, fear, to ecstasies. They're both, a psychological state. And pantas, everyone. So these clauses are very, very similar. Her argument is that they're found in very similar contexts. And in one you have VSO, one you have SVO, right? So the idea is that, well, both of these contexts are neutral, right? That's the point. And she gives, more examples of SVO, but the point here is, if she is correct, right, about this situational sentence context being a pragmatically neutral environment, and we have this alternation between VSO and SVO, then we would have to say that both are potentially basic orders, right? Both are pragmatically neutral orders, at least in some contexts. That's the idea. I do think, just when we're looking at the data. I think these are, decent examples, right? In the sense that I think the environment itself is fairly neutral. One issue with these kinds of sentences is that the subject is not an agent. And really, you do want to see that, right? Because we know that agentive subjects do sometimes behave differently, especially than subjects that might refer to a psychological state, like fear. We know that agentive subjects are often higher up in the clause, meaning they have a tendency to be before the verb, or a greater tendency to be before the verb. So this is the kind of thing where it's like, okay, I accept the environment, but it would be nice to have a better example where you don't have the subject as a psychological state. That being said, the fact that we do have sort of like this free variation between VSO and SVO is really interesting, and also, I mean, it seems to point in the direction of both being basic. Okay, so the next type of neutral context she talks about is the broad focus question. So this is a sort of a classic, okay, how do I figure out the basic word order? This is the question you ask. Unfortunately, we can't just go back in time and ask people this question. But once we see it in text, we can see how it's answered, and that presumably will give us something close to the order, hopefully the order. So a broad focus question is just what happened. And actually, Paul Krager and I, we discussed this, and he actually suggested the same thing, right? If you're looking for or for the neutral order in a particular language, don't go to narrative, but go to a dialogue where this question is asked: what happened, right? So Kirk says the answer to this question does not place narrow focus on any of the constituents. So we talked about this earlier. Questions will often be associated with focus. For example, who hit the ball, right? Tim, right? And Tim there would be in this narrow focus position. But this particular question, what happened, is very neutral, right? We don't know anything that happened, right? It's just, we're not talking about any of the constituents. We're just saying what happened, right? And we know in language after language that this is a great way to elicit the pragmatically neutral order in the language, right? So she finds one example of this that she says, okay, this might be, a broad focus question. It's not the best, example, but again, we're dealing with limited data here. So it's in the context of when the angel comes to Mary, and Mary says, "Pos estai tuto." So she says, "How, right, will this be?" That is the sort of like neutral question. She then says, "Epe andra u ginosco," since I don't know a man, sexually in this case. So the idea is that, how will I have a child? How will this happen if I've never been with a man? And then it says, "Kai apokrites ho angelos, epen aute." So, and then the angel answers her, "Pneuma hagion epeleusetai epise, kai dynamis subsistu episkiase soi." So here we have the angel answering her, and there's two clauses. Pneuma hagion starts the first one, right? And so that's the subject. And then we have the verb epeleusetai, which is not transitive. So we have subject verb, and then we don't have an object. So we have epeleusetai epise. So again, this isn't the best example because we don't have an object. But then we have another clause where we do have an object, or well, we have what she would consider an object. So we have kai dynamis subsistu, the power of the Most High. Episkiase will overshadow soi. Sorry, soi there is what she is calling an object. In this case, it would be a patient. The thematic role would be a patient. Mary is the person. So the power of the Most High will overshadow her. So she's a patient there. But soi, again, is dative and not not accusative, and it's a pronoun. And we know weird things happen with pronouns. But all that to say, it's still the best kind of example that we have in the data that she looked at. So this sort of, what happened kind of question seems to be, with in these examples, seems to be answered with SVO order with, kind of an asterisk next to the O. So that's the neutral context 2. And then neutral context 3 is the introduction to parables. So she describes this context. Introductions to parables are similar to out of the blue utterances. So similar to the broad focus question, what happened? In that none of the arguments are known in the discourse. So the idea is that we're not going to be referring back to anything, to topicalize it. And, we're probably not putting focus on anything. It's just, we're just introducing everything new. So she says that only SVO is found in these contexts. So she gives one example. I think she lists, in a footnote or something, several other examples. But the example comes from Luke 14:16. Anthropostis apoie deipnon mega. So some man was holding a great feast or meal. So in this context, anthropostis, right, is the subject. Apoie was holding or was doing, was giving. This is the verb. And then deipnon mega, this is the object. So she says that the only thing we find in these kinds of contexts is SVO. So if we just go back then and think about all the contexts we've seen, SVO is very strong in all of them. We saw them in situational sentences. We saw it in the broad focus question. We saw it, and now we see it in the introduction to parables. In each of these, we might say, okay, well, these aren't the best examples we have, but or we could have, if we were to, again, go back in time and try to elicit responses, we would want things like, full, noun phrase or determinative phrase objects, right? We would, kind of construct this context that's better than what we could have just in a text. But the fact that you do in all of the 3 neutral contexts that she, explored, you do have SVO, right? You have VSO in only one of them, situational sentences, suggests that SVO, to go back to our question, is SVO a possible basic order? Suggests pretty strongly yes. The question now is SVO always base or pragmatically neutral? If it can be sometimes, need it be pragmatically neutral? We can say that VSO, okay, sometimes it's pragmatically neutral. SVO is now pragmatically neutral. Are there marked SVO clauses? This is what we turn to now, non-neutral clauses. And she says, the short answer is yes, there are marked SVO clauses, right? And we're going to talk about why that's the case, why you can have the same string, SVO, sometimes it's neutral, sometimes it's not. But before, she actually goes through all of the data, because if we look at the data, we had more than just SVO and VSO. We had all 6 possibilities. So she goes through now and looks at all the data and says, okay, why do we have O initial clauses? So this is where she starts. This is where we will start. So OVS and OSV. Why do we have this order? What about these contexts is triggering this kind of thing? And so she says there's 2 kinds of contexts. One is the object has just been specified. So we see this in Matthew 10:5. Tutus tus dodeca apestelen ho Iesus. So here we have tutus tus dodeca. So that is the object, these 12. And in the context of Matthew 10:5, they were just named. So now it's referring back to these 12. And it says apestelen, Jesus sent out Jesus. So the idea here is that when you have just specified the object, you can refer back to it in the first position, and that serves some sort of topical function. And we have the same thing with an OSV example. Tauta karpanta ta ethne tu cosmu episdetousin. So for this example from Luke 12:30, the tauta is referring back to these things just mentioned, and then panta ta ethne tu cosmu is the subject, and episdetousin is the verb. Okay, so this is another example of how when the object has just been specified, where you can refer back to it, and it can be in the initial position. She also has examples where the object is preceded by the particle kai. So this is an important point, that kai can be a conjunction or what she is calling a particle. So when it's a particle, it's often translated as something like also. That is associated with, or even, that's associated with a focus position normally. So as a conjunction, it's not doing this. But if we look at just those cases where kai seems to be functioning as a particle, a focus particle, then we can see, okay, what is that doing and does it affect order? And it does. The tricky part about this, obviously, is that kai can also be just a plain old conjunction. So there are some cases where it's difficult to tell. So she brings up 1 Corinthians 2:11 as an example. Hutos kai ta tu theu udes egnoken. So thus, even or also the things of God, udes egnoken, no one knows. So here we have OSV, but the O is preceded by this particle kai. So kai is not functioning here to connect, this sentence to a previous sentence. It seems to be focusing the constituent ta tu theu, and that is the object. Okay, so now we have the explanation. Why do we have O initial clauses? This is why. Sometimes the object has just been specified. Sometimes the object is preceded by the particle kai. Those are the contexts in which we have it. If you see it in other contexts, the idea would be, why would it be there? But for her explanation, for her data, this is why they're there. The object in the initial position. So both of these are probably related to topic and focus in some way, right? So at this point in her dissertation, she hasn't really defined topic and focus, but when the object has just been specified, it's probably referring back to a topic, right, or topicalizing that object in some way. And then when the object is preceded by the particle kai, it's associated with focus. So the idea is that you can have the object in the initial position when you have it in a topic or focus position. So then she moves on to SOV clauses. Why do we have SOV clauses? So she has a number of reasons why, or contexts in which SOV clauses occur. One, she says, objects sometimes contain a reflexive in this kind of order for SOV. So we have 1 Corinthians 11:21. So she also includes things like to idion, which is what we'll see here. So she says, Hekasos gar to idion depnon prolambane ento phagein. So this is, again, 1 Corinthians 11:21. So we have hekastos, each, as the subject. To idion depnon, his own meal, is the object. And the idea here is that reflexive objects could be special, or she notices this pattern, right? She doesn't even explain, okay, why is the object with a reflexive before the verb, right? She doesn't explain why here, because she's just explaining, or she's just noting a pattern. So she says, okay, when you have a reflexive, you often have this order. So we might know that reflexives are special for some reason. And so, this shouldn't be counted as just a plain old neutral clause. She also notes that the object is sometimes preceded by the particle kai, in this case too, with SOV, just like we saw before. Hode theos kai ton kyrion egeren. Hode theos kai ton kyrion, right? Also the Lord, he raised up. Again, this is the same explanation. With kai ton kyrion, the kai is functioning as a focus particle, not as the conjunction. And we have this inverted, verb object, right? So we have SOV rather than SVO. And then object sometimes contains ho autos, meaning the same. And then the SOV is often common with have and do. So I'm not going to run through all these examples. You can see them for yourself. So the when the object contains hoatos, we have an example from 1 Corinthians 10:4. And when you have SOV with have and do, we have examples from Luke 6:33 and Matthew 8:20. Sorry, and you can, again, look these up. They're not super important for what we're doing. But the idea here is that with all of these clauses, we can chunk them into groups. And there are good reasons why, for example, verbs with have and do might behave differently. These are what we might call light verbs, or they are, lighter. They're not very lexical. Their meaning is often taken from the object rather than just being a plain old transitive verb. So we know that those behave differently often across languages. So they're not good examples of pragmatically neutral, really pragmatically and semantically and syntactically neutral context. And then she has some non-neutral SVO clauses. So we've already said this, right? That many people, when they have done studies of New Testament Greek, they've said, oh, okay, well, there are some examples where SVO seems to be pragmatically marked. She has, this is an example, contrast with parallel clauses. So this is from Luke 6:45. Ho agathos anthropos ek tu agathou thesaurou, tes cardias, profere to agathon, ke ho poneros ek tu ponerou, profere to poneron. So the good man from the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and the evil out of the evil treasure of his heart probably brings forth bad. So the idea is that we're contrasting the good man and the bad. We have SVO in both cases. Particularly, what's interesting is that in the second clause we would have SVO. So where the second clause is contrasting the poneros, the bad man, with the first example, the agathos anthropos, the good man. So we have this contrast with parallel clauses. What we would say is that this environment is not a neutral environment. We know that contrast is often associated with either topic or focus, actually. You can have contrastive topics or contrastive, vocalized elements. And so the idea is that this is not the best example of, a pragmatically neutral SVO sentence. And then we have cases where the subject has just been specified. So we, again, talked about this with O initial clauses. So we've seen this already in Greek, where you've specified something before, and then you can refer back to that in the initial position after you spelled it all out. And so this is actually her explanation for the genealogy, where you have the object is the subject of the next clause. So Abraham egenesen ton Isaac, and then Isaac de egenesen ton Jacob, etc., etc., etc. Isaac in the first clause is the object. It was just specified, and then it becomes the subject in the next clause. So she says, okay, well, these clauses aren't really pragmatically neutral, just not the best example of that. And she has another example from Revelation 16:3, which we don't have to get into. Hopefully you get the point. And then we have other examples where the subject is preceded by kai. Again, it's difficult to tell sometimes with kai, but she, I think, does have a convincing example from Luke 20:30-31. Kai ho deuteros, kai ho tritos, elaben auten. So, and the second and the third took her, right? It's someone talking to Jesus about, the hypothetical scenario of a man dying who has brothers. The second and the third took the first man's wife. So here, what she's saying is that kai is not a conjunction. It is this focus particle. And in that case, we have SVO. So the point is that with SVO, we have examples of this surface order in pragmatically neutral contexts. And we have examples of this same surface order in pragmatically marked contexts. And this makes sense, somewhat at least, right? Because it is the most dominant order. It would make sense that if it was possible to have both pragmatically marked SVO clauses and pragmatically neutral SVO clauses, it would make sense that, it would be more frequent. It can occur in more environments. So this is the data that she has, just a summary of marked properties across word orders. So we have cases where the S is emphasized. So she uses these kind of like neutral terms, emphasized and just specified, basically referring to focus for emphasis and specified for topic. So she says, okay, for SVO, we can have an emphasized subject. For SOV, we can't. For OVS, we can. For OSV, we can't. For VSO, we can't. For VOS, we can't. So she goes through all these different possibilities. S is emphasized, O is emphasized, S is just specified, O is just specified, contrast with parallel clauses. And she looks at all the different contexts and she says, can we find examples of this? And she says, for the different orders, these are the kinds of pragmatically marked contexts we find them in. That's the idea. So again, if you're not looking at this, I would encourage you can check it out in her dissertation. I would encourage you to do that. But we will also have it on our YouTube page where you can find this. It is basically what we just said. We just went through all the data, but it's a helpful chart to see what the different orders can be, right? And what the constituents in the different orders, how they can be emphasized, in a focus position or in a topic position. So now let's talk a little bit about the VSO SVO alternation before we wrap things up. So question, right? How can there be two pragmatically neutral orders in a language? So this kind of thing might seem counterintuitive, but honestly, most people just assume that there would only be one anyway. And there's no real reason why there should be only one. If we look at other languages have also been argued to have a similar system. So modern standard Arabic is one of them, where we have, some sort of VSO SVO alternation. Modern Greek is another one that she discusses, where people have debated about, what's the pragmatically neutral order. I personally think that VSO in modern Greek is, it seems to be a much stronger case that is the only pragmatically neutral order. And that would make sense that VSO in classical Greek was not the order. And it seems like you would have to have some sort of intermediate stage where VSO is a pragmatically neutral order, but there's another order that's also neutral. And so that seems to be what we have in New Testament Greek. In Koine, more generally maybe, that VSO and SVO are both neutral at the same time. And then another language that we've talked about has just been Biblical Hebrew, in the sense that, so if you just look at the language as a whole, there are cases where you have pragmatically neutral subject, verb, object, and there are cases where you have pragmatically neutral verb, subject, object, particularly with vayiktol clauses and vekatal clauses, where the verb moves necessarily to the initial position, but it's still pragmatically neutral. So if that's how we're defining basic, then Biblical Hebrew would also be one such system where you have this special verb form that is moving to the initial position. So part of this is how you look at it, right? If we throw those clauses out as, clauses that you shouldn't count towards the basic system, then Biblical Hebrew, our conclusion from our episode would be Biblical Hebrew would have to be SVO, right? If you just don't include the vayiktol clauses. But part of our point in that whole discussion was to say, well, what's more interesting is looking at it more fine-grained and to say, okay, what for any given verb form, for any given type of clause, what is the order we can have, and what is the order that's pragmatically neutral? So in that case, Biblical Hebrew is a good example, right? Where we have, with a particular construction, with vayiktol and vekatal, we do have VSO, right? And so we do have this alternation between VSO and SVO, and we see this in the data. The question ultimately is why. If we want to, just ask the question, okay, what's the basic, VSO or SVO? That's fine. We will often come to our conclusion based on our criteria for that question. But what's more important is just to ask us, okay, for this particular clause type, what order do we see and why? In Greek, you can have both orders because both verbs and subjects may move to create different positions with the same surface order. So we mentioned this earlier. You can have the same string of constituents, subject, verb, object, but that doesn't mean they're actually in the same order in the syntax. So you can have the same surface order, but the subject might be in a focus position that is actually a position that would normally be, to the left or higher up, but you can't tell the difference between that and when the subject is not in a focus position, but still to the left of the verb. That's the idea. And so actually, Kirks' discussion of where the subject and object are in the clause allows us to see that there are multiple derivations of unmarked and marked VSO and SVO. So she actually doesn't talk about unmarked marked VSO clauses. She says, they're difficult to categorize. It has been claimed that in some cases, VSO clauses can have a topicalized subject. And actually, her analysis allows for that. So this would be a case where the verb is to the left of the subject, right? VSO, but the subject is still a topic. The way you can derive this is allowing for multiple positions of the verb and multiple positions of the subject. And so we know from, just syntactic theory that there are multiple positions for these things. So, for example, she argues that the verb starts out in the verb phrase and moves to a tense phrase, right? So that's a certain position. That is usually thought to be to the left of the subject, which starts out in the verb phrase itself. So that would have the order VSO, that would derive the order VSO. So in this case, let me just back up. For those of you interested in syntax, I want to just run through quickly what this would look like in a syntactic tree. So if you, again, are listening to this, you can look this up in her dissertation. She has this tree where she basically gives all the potential spots for the verb and all the potential spots for the subject. And if you look at the tree, it allows us to derive all of the different orders that are possible in the language that we see in the data. So the basic idea is that we can have different spots for the verb, and when the verb moves, the subject may or may not move, and that will create a different order. Again, if you haven't listened to our episode on basic syntactic concepts, I would encourage you to listen to that if you're interested in this kind of thing. I explain what the difference is between a head, complement, and specifier, which is kind of necessary for this whole discussion. If you don't care about this stuff, you can just skip ahead 5 minutes, and you'll be totally fine. But the basic idea here is that we have unmarked derivations of VSO and marked derivations of VSO, and the same thing for SVO. So for VSO, we can have the verb in T and the subject and the specifier of VP. So we know that the tense phrase is to the left of the verb phrase. Because of that, if we have the verb in the tense head and the subject in the specifier of the verb phrase, so the specifier is the leftmost part of the phrase, but because the tense phrase is to the left of the verb phrase, when the verb is in T and the subject is in the specifier of the verb phrase, then we would have the order VSO, and the subject would not have any sort of pragmatic marking. Okay? Kirk also says that the verb can be in C, so the verb can move from T all the way to C. This kind of movement is well attested across the world's languages. Vaiktol, for example, is in C. We know that because it can't be subordinated. You can never have ki plus Vaiktol or asher plus Vaiktol. And so it is blocking that any complementizer from being there, from surfacing there, because it's already there, right? That's the idea. So in theory, for an unmarked derivation of VSO, you could have the verb in C, or you could have the subject in the specifier of VP, which is what we said last time. That's to the right of the verb, or the subject in TP, which would also be to the right of the verb. We know that the basic order, this is from Kirks' dissertation here. She has VP, TP, topic P, complementizer P, right? Phrase. So the P stands for phrase. So that's the order of the constituents or the phrases. So if the verb is in C all the way to the left, then you could have the subject anywhere to the right and you're still going to have VSO order surface. So that also predicts that you could have the subject as marked as a topic if the verb is in the complementizer phrase, or if it's in that phrase, then the subject could still be marked as a topic and it would still have VSO order, right? And so this is actually the claim that's been made, is that some VSO clauses have a topicalized subject, and this is predicted. As long as this verb is in C, you would still have this. We could also have an unmarked derivation of SVO. So she says that if the verb is in T, right, which is what she says is the default, the subject could be in the specifier of TP. We know that the specifier is the leftmost part of the whatever phrase we're talking about. So if the verb is the head, then and the subject is the specifier of the same phrase, then the subject would have to be before the verb, right? We have SVO. The specifier of the tense phrase is a pragmatically neutral slot. We're not going to see a special meaning of the subject in that position. However, the subject in theory could move further to the left in a position that is in a topic phrase, right? Or closer to the complementizer phrase. And we would still have the order SVO. The subject would be in a different position, specifier topic P, but it would still be to the left of the verb, right? The verb could stay in T. The topic or the subject would still be to the left, but it would have a different interpretation. It would then be interpreted as a topic. So that is just, again, syntactic speech for those of you that have some syntactic theory in your background, or that kind of syntactic theory. It is helpful, I think, to see how all these orders are possible from a theoretical standpoint, and it actually does derive all of these both marked and unmarked orders for SVO and VSO. So what conclusions have we come to? First of all, against most New Testament Greek scholarship, VSO does not seem to be the only basic or neutral word order. SVO is also possibly neutral. So this seems pretty solid. I mean, we looked at 3, neutral contexts. We said we would prefer for each one of them. A few things were different. But that being said, SVO was dominant in each of those 3 neutral contexts. We had one VSO example, but we had many SVO examples. So it seems like SVO is a possibly neutral order. SVO is also statistically dominant. So that is very clear from the data from Levitas and from Kirk. SVO is just more common. But it is more common in both pragmatically neutral and pragmatically marked clauses. So that could be why it's more common. It can be pragmatically neutral and pragmatically marked, and it is very common in both of those contexts. The subject and the verb can be in different places in the syntax, which accounts for the various orders we see. So this was the more theoretical discussion that we had. You do have different places for the subject and the verb, and that can account for all the different orders we see, but also, the same surface order being sometimes neutral and sometimes not. And that's exactly what we have in New Testament Greek. So just to go back over from a high level what we've talked about. First, we talked about the basic order. We talked about the definition of that and the criteria. And we basically said that we're going to define basic order as any pragmatically neutral sentence. And then we looked at previous work and the debate that has occurred because of it. So we said that some people say SVO is basic, some people say VSO is basic. Many of those studies have focused more on frequency and less on pragmatically neutral. But some have noted that there seem to be examples of both SVO and VSO in pragmatically neutral contexts. We looked at the statistics in the New Testament. We saw that SVO is dominant by pretty much everyone's counts. Then we looked at Kirks Data. We saw that all orders are possible. So we saw that there are some contexts where O can be first. There are some contexts where we have SVO, some contexts where we have VSO, etc., etc. And then we looked at the sentence types. So we discussed how we need to look at what we're counting. So for example, Kirk defines objects semantically. Levitas defines it syntactically, looking at only accusative objects. And so we said, okay, this will affect the data. And we generally agree with Kirk in how she is counting clauses. And we looked at her word order data. And this lined up, pretty well with the other data that we've seen. And we looked at 3 neutral contexts: situational sentences, broad focus questions, introductions to parables. SVO was found in all 3, and VSO was found in situational sentences. So if those are both good examples of pragmatically neutral contexts, then we would have to conclude that both of those are neutral orders or basic in the language. Then we said that there are, this handful of clauses that are non-neutral. So we looked at O initial, SOV, and SVO, and all the contexts in which those occurred where it was clear that there was some sort of pragmatic marking or some sort of context that might trigger a pragmatic meaning to one of the constituents. Then we looked at the VSO SVO alternation. We saw that this is attested in the world's languages. This is done in different ways. It kind of depends on your analysis of several things, what you're counting, what you're not counting. But given that there can be different places for the subject and the verb, we can derive this sort of alternation if we allow for the subject and the verb to land in different spots, right? And so, for all the people that love syntax out there, we said that the verb is normally in T. The verb may move to C, and the subject can be in the specifier of the VP, the TP, or the topic phrase, and that allows for this VSO SVO alternation, and it allows for SVO to be marked sometimes and unmarked at other times, and the same thing for VSO. So that is all we have time for on this episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast. Thank you to all of our listeners out there.